Thanks everyone to join us tonight or the morning in China. And my name is Aqualung Therapeutics. I'm the CEO of MSQ Ventures. So we are based in New York City, and we are the advisory firm to trying to have a bridge the Western and the China, the biotech industry. And today, I'm very honored to have the special speaker of Stan and join me and to share his view of the current like a sad event, the coronavirus going on, and also most important, he will provide and share the insight of the company he works for as a CEO, Aqualung Therapeutics. How do they develop the treatment to fight against the coronavirus? So let's welcome Stan. Stan, thank you so much for taking time.
Thank you very much, Echo, for that kind introduction. I very much appreciate this opportunity to have this discussion with you and your team, as well as provide some insight into Aqualung Therapeutics and our overall platform technology. So very much looking forward to this and answering some questions that those on the line may have as well.
Thank you. And also, we have another guest speaker, is Dr. Shang. And Dr. Shang is our venture partner at the MSQ, and he is from Beijing. And today he will join me and to share his perspective about your technology as an investor and also the medical expert. Shang, welcome. Shang, can you hear us? Yeah, for any reason.
Hello.
Hi, Sean. Thanks for joining us tonight. How's
Yeah,
Beijing?
hello. You can hear me?
Yes.
Yes, yeah. Beijing is very good. It's very sunny. Actually, China is very good, and I see only about 30 to 40 new confirmed patients yesterday. So the situation is good. Everything changes very well.
That's really wonderful. I'm so happy to hear about that. After the almost 2 or 3 months fighting, finally we can go back to the normal life. I saw the people are so excited about the traffic. Finally, we will back to the normal. And Stan, I know actually like in the past 2 months, MSQ, we have been the team working so hard, trying to help China, but actually we kind of the coronavirus, it seems to step into US now, and also in the past week, it's made such a huge impact on our normal life, and also the stock market crashed, and even the president have been, they were suspect he met someone who are infected, and so is the whole country, that's only topic going on now. So from your 35 years experience as healthcare expert, what's your insight, and also where do you see what's going on and what's going to be next?
Well, thank you, Echo. I think this is certainly a fluid situation, and like most, I always preface things by saying I'm not a doctor and I'm not a clinician, but as someone that's a citizen, I certainly am always very interested in learning from our experts. And in this particular instance, it's the CDC, the NIH, the state and local health authorities, everybody working in collaboration to try and get some sort of resolution to this within the last week. And I think even as of today, the U.S. has over 1,200 cases, with unfortunately 32 patients have died. But I think when we look at a population of 360+ million people, we're off to a start, but I think that it's, as the CDC has clearly stated, there's going to be more cases, and we have to get very aggressive. And there's certainly a lot of things that are transpiring as it relates to, at the state level, in particular with communities. There's a heavy emphasis on what's happening with the elderly and the senior care population, making sure that there's tremendous infectious control techniques in place. But in the end, it really comes down to the vigilance of everyday citizens taking all the necessary precautions. But I'm honored to be part of the biotech community and the medical technology community that's working collaboratively and diligently to try and find some solutions, whether it be through diagnostics, whether it be through vaccines or certain antiviral therapies. And in our case, the ability for the more advanced patients who may have acute lung injury, everyone's working in a holistic fashion to try and see if we can come up with some solutions. So hopefully we will be on the other side of this, but I think there's more to come. And it's probably going to be a matter of weeks before we finally get our arms around this completely and hopefully see some sort of stabilization with at least new transfers to patients at this point in time.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. So actually, in the past week, we know the U.S. stock market have been crashed and actually have been going down every day. And so a lot of the industry have been suffering now, and the retail and the restaurant and the travel, and so many of the investors are put hope on the biotech, especially for the companies who are working on the coronavirus. And on the other hand, actually, it seems we have no such the capability to stop the coronavirus to outbreak, but the only solution we can have for us to win this war is to actually to cure it and treat it. So where do you see the challenges and opportunities for the global cooperation, especially for the company like yours working on the coronavirus treatment?
Well, I was fortunate to participate actually as a listener to a global WebEx, which happened a few weeks back, and there were over 4,000 people who attended that session, and it was from all over the world, which I think was very exciting. There were antiviral experts, there were vaccine experts, and there were diagnostic experts. But I think the beauty of a meeting like that was to share information. So within the medical community, the life sciences, I think things are going as well as they can from the perspective of every country is sharing what they can. I will say that from our perspective, sometimes it can be a challenge to get your hands on specific samples in order to do some additional clinical work. But we're working with the health authorities to be able to do that. And in the United States, and I think as we look to collaborate with other partners outside of the United States who certainly have better access to perhaps some of the patient samples, it will allow us to be able to really discern from our perspective how our drug can and potentially have a benefit for those patients who are, again, end-stage patients. Our drug will not cure the coronavirus. There are others that are certainly working on that, and there's many vaccines in place. But the goal is to try and make sure that in all phases of the disease, whether it's early, middle, or late stages, that there's some sort of therapeutic intervention to potentially slow the disease or certainly save the life of the person that has other comorbidities.
Yeah, that's very important to know. So as you just mentioned about your company have been working on that. So how long have you been working on that? And also, by the way, congratulations on your NIH, the grant. So what does that mean to like your firm, your company, and also what's that helpful for you to move to next step?
Well, thank you for congratulating us. We're very pleased with some of our more recent NIH grants, and this one in particular has to do with ventilator-induced lung injury, which is important for patients that are end-stage coronavirus patients, because many of them don't necessarily die from the coronavirus per se. What ends up happening to those patients is they have advanced very severe lung disease, and they're put on a ventilator, and the ventilator in and of itself can help save the life of the patient. However, if the cytokine storm and inflammation just runs rampant, unfortunately what ends up happening is organ failure. And so while a ventilator can keep someone alive, ultimately it's the organ failure which is the demise of the patient. So we were incorporated in 2016. We have some earlier research which validated our science, but our whole focus as an organization initially has been to treat these patients with acute lung injury because there's such a high mortality rate. And quite frankly, there's been no new novel therapies introduced for patients that have acute respiratory distress syndrome in the last 20 years. There's only supportive care and then using the ventilator to try and maintain some sort of life for the patient. So we're excited about this opportunity to advance our therapy. And with this NIH grant, we have the ability to move our lead compound into pharmacodynamic, pharmacokinetic, and toxicology studies as quickly as possible. And so that's exciting for us as coming in as non-dilutive capital, but also helping us quickly advance this into IND-enabling studies.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's really the breakthrough technology and really help with especially the senior people and who are have the high mortality for the coronavirus. So I really cannot wait to learn more about the technology. So next, we will have the Stan to present the deck about the technology and the company strategy. Thank you, Stan.
Okay, thank you, Echo. Let me just do a quick switch here and try and make sure that my screen is being shared and you're seeing the slide deck. Do you see the slide deck on the screen?
Not yet.
Okay, you still do not see the deck?
No.
No.
Okay. Okay.
I think this works now.
Okay, is that any better?
Yes,
sorry about that.
It works. It's great. Perfect.
Okay, let me make sure that I pull that up. Okay, so there we go. Well, thank you again, Echo. I appreciate it, and I'll take the next few minutes to discuss with you the exciting platform technology that Aqualung Therapeutics is developing. As this title slide essentially states, we are an early stage biotech company that's developing an innate immunity-focused anti-inflammatory therapeutic platform. Now, there's a lot of words in there, but I think the key element that we're looking to address as the key problem is that we're focused on finding solutions to runaway inflammation or unchecked inflammation. Others may use the term cytokine storm, but I think it's very common when we look at pro-inflammatory diseases. And we're addressing this through a platform technology which we call enantHor. So a platform typically starts with what is your target and what are you trying to address? Well, it was through the genomics research of our founder, Dr. Garcia, when he was the chair of pulmonary at Johns Hopkins, where he isolated this upstream protein called NAMT, and nicotinamide phosphorobosyl transferase has clearly been demonstrated to be highly instrumental in downstream inflammation. And so with that in mind, and looking for a solution to acute lung injury, he recognized that this NAMT protein was significantly expressed in multiple conditions, but especially with those that had acute lung injury. So in order to address this, we have a three-pronged approach as part of our platform. The first is to look at developing a therapeutic, of which we have a humanized monoclonal antibody called ALT-100. This is a next-generation monoclonal antibody that basically neutralizes NAMT to block this unchecked inflammation. We also have two other very important components, which is an eNAMT diagnostic biomarker, as well as NAMT genotyping assays. And the importance of those is that we believe we have the potential to actually predict responders. So this will become personalized medicine. We're on track to achieve our milestones. We expect within the next 12 to 18 months, we will file an IND submission with our lead indication of acute respiratory distress syndrome. And then we have some chronic indications as well from this lead monoclonal that will look at prostate cancer and pulmonary hypertension, where we would work those in parallel to also submit an IND application. We have a deep experienced team that has a lot of experience in both biotech as well as pharma. From an academic perspective, as well as working with both private and public companies, we have the experience from a clinical development perspective, and then my experience as well on the commercialization side. The thing that we're most pleased of is the fact that we've already to date received in excess of $5 million in non-dilutive grants. This certainly is beneficial from a cap table perspective, but most importantly, it validates our science, and we're very pleased with this. And I think it's an indicator that the NIH and the Department of Defense believe that there's some valid science when we look at eNAMT as the upstream protein target. We also are working to make sure that as we do all of our work, we have a strong patent portfolio. Now, if I go to the next slide, it's a bit busy and it's a bit scientific, but I think it's always fair to highlight the mechanism of action of your monoclonal therapeutic, and at the same time be able to try and differentiate slightly how we may be different than other monoclonals on the market. So if we think about eNAMT itself, it's already circulating in the blood. But what happens is when there's some sort of activating signal, it could be a danger signal, and that signal could come from trauma, it could come from hypoxia, and in this particular case, it could come from the coronavirus. Well, what happens is extracellular NAMT is dramatically expressed, 3 to 10-fold. And what happens is it's secreted in the blood, and it binds to a ligand of toll-like receptor 4. And for those on the phone that are clinicians, they know that toll-like receptor 4 is right down the middle of the plate in terms of innate immunity. And when it binds to toll-like receptor 4, it activates a transcription factor, NF-kappa B, and ultimately this is what leads to this runaway or systemic inflammation and ultimately organ dysfunction. So our monoclonal antibody, ALT-100, it binds it binds to eNAMT, and it neutralizes this and mitigates this downstream cytokine storm effect. So from a mechanistic standpoint, we believe that by targeting an upstream protein as opposed to a singular downstream cytokine, we have the ability to attenuate all of the downstream cytokines versus just one of the individual cytokines. With that in mind, I think it sheds light on the fact that when you look at unchecked inflammation, there's multiple conditions with which our compound can potentially work. And if we look at the left side, we see some acute indications. On the right side, we see some chronic indications. And those that are asterisked in red, what's important to recognize is that all of our preclinical evidence has been funded by some sort of non-dilutive grants. We are looking at some additional grants coming in as well, looking at radiation-induced lung injury, and we expect those to be forthcoming in short order. So if we look at some of the preclinical models, I won't spend an inordinate amount of time on these, but suffices to say that for those that have some experience looking at histologic slides, these are all preclinical models, but when we look at the left side of each of these indications, whether it's a blast injury to a rat from a trauma-induced lung injury, the left side indicates where you see the denseness in the purple staining, where you see significant inflammation. And then on the right side, with the infusion of our monoclonal ALT-100, you see significant attenuation of those inflammatory cytokines. And when we look at the blast trauma lung injury score, it was statistically significant. And this is a consistent theme irrespective of the indication. Our ALT-100 has the ability to work in multiple indications. I'd like to highlight on the right slide the pulmonary hypertension model. This is a monocrotaline staining, and you can see that the occluded vessel essentially on the left, and then on the right side after the infusion, we actually see the occlusion beginning to dissipate. And most importantly, when we look at right ventricular pressure, we actually see some significant improvement in both cardiac index as well as lung output. We also have some other indications where we've received NIH funding looking at this monoclonal. And you can see the left, it's intrauterine infections related to premature births. In the United States, there's over 400,000 premature birth deliveries on an annual basis, and 70% of those women have some sort of intrauterine infection. We call that chorioamnionitis. And in a preclinical model, we were able to demonstrate with the infusion of ALT-100, not only was the delivery delayed, but when the delivery did occur, there was significantly improved lung function and less inflammatory markers in those pups that were born. Big difference for those that did get the ALT-100 in terms of an 85% success rate for survivability versus an 85% mortality rate for those that were born prematurely. We also have some very exciting data in prostate cancer, and I'll get into that a little bit later. And then similarly, when we look at radiation fibrosis. So to get focused, our lead indication is acute lung injury, and I've highlighted that, I think, in a couple different places within this slide deck, and talked about the significant unmet medical need and the high mortality rate. And unfortunately, there's no FDA-approved therapies at this point, whether it be a device or a therapeutic. And so we see this as a significant breakthrough where we have the ability to attenuate the downstream cytokine storm and hopefully be a potential benefit for those end-stage coronavirus patients who have advanced to the point where they are in an ARDS condition. And that's what we're actually focused on, is to have less days on the ventilator and then ultimately demonstrate a mortality benefit for these patients. When we look at our lead chronic indication of pulmonary hypertension, there's approximately 200,000 pulmonary hypertension patients in the US. This falls under an orphan designation, but this is again an unmet need because there's really only combination therapy that slows the disease, but there's no therapeutics currently that have the ability to reverse the course of this disease or certainly demonstrate significant survival benefit. And lastly, with prostate cancer, we know that if the prostate cancer can be confined as an indolent tumor for those men who have had androgen deprivation therapy, there is a very high survival rate. The unfortunate thing is when that prostate cancer transitions from an indolent tumor to a metastatic tumor, the mortality rate is significantly increased. And so we do know that inflammation plays a major role in this transition. And when we measured NAMP levels in men who had transitioned to metastatic cancer, the NAMP levels were significantly increased tenfold. So we believe that our therapy has the potential to be able to slow this transition from an indolent tumor to a metastatic tumor. So we're very excited about that as well. When we look at our compound as it relates to unchecked inflammation, I'd say the gold standard is a product like Humira. It's a highly successful drug, and for good reason. It's very potent as an anti-TNF agent, works in autoimmune disease, but they have multiple indications. When we look at ALT 100, we put ourselves in a category somewhat similar in that we have multiple indications. We have a biomarker assay, and we have a genotyping assay, and a novel mechanism of action that works more upstream to be able to mitigate the downstream sequela of the cytokine storm. Other products that are in development for ARDS, I've highlighted just a few here. Some are early and some are late. They all have a different mechanism of action, yet none of them have any sort of biomarker assay or genotyping assay as well. And so we believe that this is a significant differentiating factor as it relates to clinical development. Now, with respect to clinical development, we believe that we've de-risked our strategy as much as possible by the use of a diagnostic biomarker as well as the genotyping panel. And we intend to use these as early as a phase 1b study. So with that in mind, if we look at our clinical development, an impending respiratory failure on the left side, these are the various injurious stimuli. You can see coronavirus down there, and our expectation would be that a patient gets immediately screened with our biomarker panel and genotyping assay to determine their NAMP levels. And then what would immediately happen is if that patient is in crisis and needs to be intubated, our expectation is, depending on their NAMP levels, we would then immediately intubate as soon as possible. And then we would administer our therapy. This is quite a bit different, and there's a reason that many drugs have failed in ARDS. And part of that reason is if you wait 24 to 72 hours after the patient has been intubated, then there's a high probability that the cytokine storm has already happened, and there's an inability for your therapeutic to have any sort of a positive response. So we look at this almost like the cardiovascular world looks at an acute MI, where if a patient comes in, they get a CKMB test or a troponin test, they're immediately whisked to the cath lab if it's positive, or they're given a thrombolytic agent. And we believe that there needs to be significant progress in time to therapy when we look at patients that come in that have impending respiratory failure. And we believe a combination of biomarkers coupled with early intervention, we have a high degree of probability of success with our clinical trial. Very quickly, just a couple more slides. Our clinical development to date, we started with 2 murine monoclonal antibodies, and we are now, both of those have been humanized. We are in stable cell line development and in discussions with multiple potential manufacturing partners. And we're looking to do our single cell cloning as we speak. And so we're very far along, and the intent for the rest of this year is to initiate PD, PK, and tox. And then as soon as we get some appropriate funding, we would immediately begin our IND enabling studies and start the manufacturing process. So we're in a position to file an IND within 12 to 18 months. We have a strong patent protection strategy. I won't go into all of these in detail, other than saying that from a method of use, in some we've already received we've been granted patents. Others are in PCT. And then as of August of 2019, we filed a composition of matter patent, not only on our lead monoclonal antibody, ALT 100, but also on several backup candidates as well. And we feel like we're in a very good insulated position there. We filed in not only the United States, but in China and other key global markets as well. So as we get to the conclusion here, our funding to date and use of proceeds, we've raised a total of $6.2 million, of which the majority of that has come from non-dilutive grants. You can see we did a seed stage, and the terms of that convertible note are outlined on the slide. We are currently seeking a Series A. We're seeking $15 million in total. If we can move forward with a Chinese development program in parallel, we would be seeking $20 million total. But what's really, really important for us initially is this first tranche of $5 million where we can finalize the stable cell line development and immediately pivot, get our research cell bank over to the appropriate manufacturer so we can begin all of our IND enabling studies for the acute respiratory distress syndrome indication. That will then, we will make sure that we do everything within ICH guidelines, and our expectation, we would work with a Chinese CRO and regulatory authorities, but our hope was that if we do everything within ICH guidelines, that the IND tox package and everything would be granted as well in China, so we could immediately move forward with phase 1 studies in China at the same time that we're moving forward with phase 1 safety studies in the US. The second series tranche of 10 million clearly is for the clinical studies, both safety, and then we would intend to do a 1B study in ARDS patients where we would certainly look at biomarkers. The management team is very accomplished. Our founder, Dr. Garcia, great academic experience, but also a leader of some very major health systems within the United States. He's also is a visiting professor in China with some of the key academic institutions in China. Myself has a background of 35 years in industry. At one point was president of Sucampo Pharma Americas for approximately 6 years. And then Miriam Morris operates as our chief financial officer, both private and public experience in life sciences, and she's been through a couple of IPOs as well. We have a scientific advisory board with some key academicians that you can see here on the slide from very reputable institutions. And Dr. Macias was an integral part of the industry when he was at Eli Lilly, working on their sepsis drug. So he brings a wealth of experience to us from a clinical development perspective as well. So in closing, I'd just like to say that hopefully I've given you some insight into our eNAMPTOR therapeutic platform, comprised of a humanized monoclonal antibody, ALT-100, but more importantly, the eNAMPT biomarker and genotyping assays, which have been validated and we believe can be very critical from the perspective of a risk mitigation strategy and ensuring who is going to ultimately benefit the most from this therapy. We believe our target of NAMPT is a critical target that's instrumental in downstream inflammation. And as a novel mechanism of action, we believe that we have the ability to address unchecked inflammation differently than some of the other monoclonals on the market that specifically focus on one of the individual cytokines. We have large unmet markets, unmet needs in the markets we're seeking. We're going after indications that are not Me Too indications, but they're either orphan designation or have high mortality, or they're areas of significant unmet medical need. And we believe that we're poised, if we get the appropriate funding, to move this forward as quickly as possible and get ALT-100 into the clinic as quickly as we can. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much for the time and answer any specific questions you may have.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stan, for the very insight about your technology and how you develop the technology to fight the disease. So next, actually, I have to have our venture partner, Dr. Sean from Beijing, and so first, Sean, do you have any question? And also, he will share his insight from the investor's perspective.
Thank you.
Let me see. Is that? Sean, can you hear us now?
Okay. Yes, I'm okay.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, you have a good technology, And I think as you are the technology and the future product, we have so many indications. So just like you said, maybe it's the next Humira have a very big market. And and I think really you have a good business model because you not only have the diagnostic, but you also have the therapeutic products. So it's just like a closed loop. You have the total solutions. Because when I see some other projects in China or some projects overseas, they can just only have the diagnostics product or only have the therapeutics, but you both have the diagnostic and the therapeutic. So I think that this is a difference from your company and the other company. So I really think this is very good. And I will have the questions is about like the clinical data. You still need time to validate them. And my first question is that as you have a lot of indications and you point out that the prostate and some other indications. So yeah, when you to determine the most important indication, how do you determine which will be the first indication?
Thank you, Sean. It's a great question. So I would say that we are absolutely leading with acute respiratory distress syndrome as our lead acute indication. Not only just from the standpoint, we do a standard analysis when we look at both qualitative and quantitative research, looking at the market size, the unmet medical need, and the ability to get fast track designation through the FDA, et cetera. So we look at each of these indications somewhat in a silo, but then we also try and say, well, where is the greatest unmet medical need and what can we get to market quickest? And with that in mind, we're definitely leading with the acute lung injury model. We have the funding from the NIH to do all of our preclinical and tox work. What we don't have is the funding to do the manufacturing, but since we have that funding and it's a significant unmet medical need with a high mortality rate, that clearly when we do a net present value model was exceedingly high and sort of rose to the top in many of our different analyses. The second for us is most likely pulmonary hypertension. Again, a significant unmet medical need. While a smaller number of patients, there's really been nothing that's been able to reverse the course of this disease other than slow the disease down. And based on our preclinical model, we feel that those two, again, through some appropriate market research and doing some internal modeling, we feel that those two, from not only a U.S. perspective, but an ex-U.S. perspective, and the orphan designation for pulmonary hypertension, those are our two lead indications, one being acute, one chronic. We would put prostate cancer somewhat on the back burner. A part of that just has to do with funding, but we would look to try and parlay some of our early tox work with ALT 100 and see if we could use that towards prostate cancer. But clearly it becomes an issue of focus and focused execution. And at this point, it's ARDS followed by pulmonary arterial hypertension.
Yes, and I think as you have the most important two indications, and I think in the future maybe you can partner with some of the other indications to other companies, because you need to have a lot of money, a lot of efforts to make sure one or two indications will be developed.
That's correct. I think there is clearly there's other licensing opportunities with prostate cancer. Certainly there's the oncology play there. And we have we're working on NASH and some other areas. But again, what we want to make sure that we maintain focus and use our financial resources as prudently as possible as well, in addition to maximizing the non-dilutive capital that's come in to explore the specific indications that we're most happy about. And we feel that we can get the earliest return for our investors and are the most unmet medical needs.
Yes, yeah. Do you have any anticipation that the diagnostic product will be launched in the market? Because maybe the diagnostic testing suite will be easier.
Well, that's another great question. I will say that we are not a diagnostics company, but we are working diligently with other companies to ensure that our thesis from a diagnostic perspective is validated. But we would intend to do a partnership or alignment with another diagnostic company, quite frankly, to see if we can have a complementary diagnostic, a point of care assay ready at the time of launch. It's a whole separate work stream, obviously, and we're focused as a therapeutics company, but we are also driven by making sure that from a personalized medicine perspective, we're ensuring the right patients will get our therapeutic. And we have an NIH grant to work on our whole diagnostic biomarker. So it's being funded from a development standpoint. But we would look to license that technology with an appropriate diagnostic company that does this for a living. And hopefully they could launch in parallel to roughly around the same time that we look to exploit this.
Yeah, I agree that the therapeutic was most important part, but I also think the diagnostic testing suite will generate some cash flow in a short time, because sometimes the investors, they will care about it, and they think if you have some cash flow either from the diagnostic or other services, it will be better to validate the company's value.
That's a great point. Thank you. That's good insight. I'll definitely take that to heart.
Yeah, and also in the past, I've seen some business model, some companies in China. They both have the diagnostic and the therapeutic, and in the long way, the diagnostic and the therapeutic, they both develop well. Then they will think another model to separate the two parts, and the two parts also develop very well. So you can just have a thing. Either you develop a diagnostic or you co-develop a diagnostic part with other partners. It will be a good point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. And for the ALT100 product, and as you are developing some monoclonal antibody and other technologies, maybe you still need maybe you have to think about the manufacturing in the future. I don't know if you will manufacture product by yourself or you can outsource in the manufacturer. So I know this need many years, maybe 2 to 3 years, maybe more years. But do you have any initial ideas?
Oh no, we will absolutely be outsourcing our manufacturing. We are in active dialogue with at least 6 different CDMOs, a couple of which are located in China, and some bigger names within the United States as well. And we're looking to see if we can get the key agreement done in relatively short order. Part of it is driven by our funding, but we are in deep discussions. And again, I think our preference is to out-license to the appropriate CDMO with strong biologics experience and someone that has a great track record.
Okay, thanks. I also have some other friends. They study about some CDM business in China and also in the United States. If you have any needs, we can do the introduction.
Okay, great. No, thank you. That'd be great.
Maybe Echo?
Yeah. So Stan, as a promising anti-cancer target, NAMPIT has been the subject of intensive drug discovery research. Actually, there are many companies working on that. So how do you differentiate yourself?
No, that's a great question. So I think there's a lot of literature on what's referred to as intracellular NAMT, and NAMT in and of itself, and many of those have been in oncology and with small molecules. What they have been able to, unfortunately, one of the things that the problems with those has been the toxicity. And what we focus on, which is different, is extracellular NAMT, not intracellular NAMT. And we're actually working differently, and by our mechanism binding to a ligand of toll-like receptor 4, we actually, in many respects, preserve a certain amount of good inflammation that happens. I think one of the common questions we get all the time is, well, if sometimes you need inflammation, and that's very true. And as a next generation monoclonal, what we've identified is through genome-wide expression data is that our monoclonal does not suppress the antiviral pathways. And this is very important because and by also binding to only that TLR4 ligand, and not the actual receptor itself, the bacterial response pathway, it basically remains intact. So the good news from this for patients, if it's COVID-19 or if it's some sort of a bacterial infection or sepsis, you need TLR4 to fight that bacterial infection. And we preserve a certain function of that receptor by only binding to a ligand of toll-like receptor 4. So we believe that from a specific mechanism perspective of being extracellular NAMT versus intracellular NAMT, there is a significant difference. And eNAMT is really focused on innate immunity pathways, which is quite a bit different than the mechanism that's being worked on with intracellular NAMT. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was looking for. And also, I just want to follow up that question. You just mentioned that's a potential have the efficacy on the coronavirus. So there's an audience ask, do you mind to share some of the go into more the detail about data you can share?
Well, I think, yeah, and again, I want to be very clear as it relates to this, because when we think of, COVID-19, again, it's going to be the antiviral therapies and some of the other efforts in place to actually curb this disease at its earlier state. What we work on is for patients that are more advanced COVID-19 patients who have where the infection has gotten deep into the lungs, they're on a ventilator in the ICU. And what may have caused them to go into the ICU is COVID-19, but ultimately what they're evolving to is acute lung injury, specifically acute respiratory distress syndrome. So the data that we're actually sharing is for those patients who evolve from COVID-19 to ARDS, and the number one cause of mortality for patients with COVID-19 is ARDS. So it's sort of a 1-2 punch, right? You have to, if you can stop COVID-19 from becoming more advanced, then all the better, and there will be no need for our drug. Our drug would be for those that have more advanced disease who acquire ARDS, and then you're looking for a solution to mitigate the cytokine storm and get that patient off the ventilator and ultimately have some sort of a survival benefit. So all of our data is, again, very much preclinical at this point. With our biomarkers, however, and our genotyping assays, we have demonstrable human tissue data that clearly shows that those with higher NAMT levels have a significantly higher mortality rates. And we've also, that's also been validated when we look at our genetic SNPs. So that's our current data set. We certainly have much to share. And if anybody's interested We have a data room, and it's open for business, and we'll certainly share everything that we have as it relates to our data, but it's tied to the acute lung injury model for those end-stage patients. I hope that answers your question.
Yes. So to follow up this question is, are you in any fast track clinical trial? Do you plan to do that? Because I think that is a huge issue now, especially in Seattle, Washington State. There are several of the senior house have been in the big trouble with this virus. So do you plan to do something with them?
Well, absolutely. We not only, our most recent NIH grant is actually a fast track STTR, and that is funding the PD, PK, and tox work for our lead indication of ventilator-induced lung injury, ARDS. And we have yet to have a pre-IND meeting with the FDA, but it is our expectation that we would be fast-tracked based on the indication and the high mortality and unmet need. But at the same time, we're also applying for Department of Defense grants, other studies as well. And our goal is to, as quickly as possible, get through our IND enabling study so we can get fast-tracked and get into clinic. We have great anticipation that this will be fast-tracked. We must first, however, get through all of our IND enabling studies as quickly as possible. And that means we need to collaborate with a manufacturer to get the monoclonal manufactured as quickly as possible. But MABs tend to take some time. But there are some that have that even have internal fast-tracked manufacturing processes, and that's something that we're taking under consideration.
Okay, so that's good news. And so, do you know, just in general, I know you will have the meeting with the FDA, but do you know how many patients will need for this fast track, and what timeline looks like?
Yeah, well, I think when we look at a phase 1A safety study, it's no more than approximately 30 patients. And then we would be looking at anywhere from 40 to 70 patients of a 1B study as a proof of concept study in ARDS patients. We are looking at a much larger phase 2A study. And we would, our hopeful discussions with the FDA would be to also look at a couple things, either the N of 1 strategy, because we're very focused on a biomarkers and genomics, a biomarkers and a genotyping assay platform. But we do think that there could be some unique discussions like they are doing in oncology with an N of 1 strategy. But irrespective of that, we would still be looking at a couple hundred patients in a phase 2 study of ARDS patients. The timeline for those, again, I think if we would expect to get through a 1A and 1B study. The moment we get some initial funding, we would expect to have those completed within 24 months. And that's really tied to the manufacturing, quite frankly, and getting, because we can move quickly on PD, PK, and tox. The phase 2 study would certainly be much more robust, and that's going to take a good 18 months as well. But our hope is that with a fast track discussion, there would hopefully be some adaptive trial designs that could give us a bit more of an accelerated timeline where we can do we would do a 2A study, but then look to do a 2B/3 study, so we could try and get to market that much sooner. Okay,
so it looks like still like 2 or 3 years to go, right? At least.
That's correct. I think at this point, but I think 2 years at a minimum, we can get through a phase 1A and 1B study where we will hopefully demonstrate proof of concept in humans, and then be at a major inflection point, either to continue to move forward or do a licensing agreement. But we're prepared to go the full distance internally. But however, we would look for options to try and get this to market as quickly as possible. And if that means an out-licensing arrangement, we're certainly open to that as well.
That's great. And so, because we just have the 5 minutes left, so there's a question about what's your China strategy?
Well, I think the important thing in many companies, especially both early stage biotech companies as well as many pharma companies, everybody often states they have a desire to be in the Chinese market for various reasons. One of the main reasons, of course, being patient population. Personally, I have some experience working with another pharmaceutical company in my previous roles with some licensing agreements and working with some Chinese pharmaceutical companies. And Dr. Garcia, as I mentioned, is a visiting professor at Guangzhou Medical University and Fudan University, and he's very tightly affiliated with some key opinion leaders and major scientists such as Dr. Zhang in China. And so our parallel strategy is to not just based on the coronavirus, but the unmet medical need for those with acute respiratory distress syndrome. ARDS is a big issue in China. The ICUs are filled with patients on ventilators, and it is our goal, and certainly would be the goal, to collaborate with some of the key opinion leaders in China and some of these major respiratory centers to have a parallel development program. We would look to work with a CRO and consultancy agencies within China to make sure that they're handling all of the appropriate regulatory discussions and making sure that the clinical trials are designed appropriately within China. But our goal is to try and use our tox work and all of our preclinical IND work in China, so we can immediately move at the same time we're moving in the United States with the phase 1A and 1B studies in China at the same time. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's it's very clear and it's very detailed. Thanks. So what's your criteria? It's just like you mentioned that you're open to license out. And what's your criteria for your Chinese partners?
Well, from a pharmaceutical perspective, certainly we don't want to only look at the criteria of companies that are focused on respiratory, but that certainly is one key element. We're looking at companies that are willing to explore more early stage companies, companies that even whether it's preclinical or those that have at least completed IND enabling studies. We're looking for those that also bring some muscle and expertise from a Chinese regulatory and clinical development perspective. Should there be an appropriate licensing, that they can essentially pick up some of the key elements within China and do all of those necessary developments. Lastly, if they are involved in biologics, all the better, because that shows that they have some experience in that realm, and they have a commercial footprint in both acute and chronic indications. So I think some of those are some of the criteria that we're looking at, but certainly those that are willing to invest in platform technologies and some that will recognize the importance of biomarkers and genotyping assays as an integral part of their clinical development as well.
That is very clear, and also I think you have a very clear picture about your partners. Definitely, I think the audience today will reflect on that, and also we will help to communicate with that. And because of the time, and it's 9 o'clock, and so we have to end today. But we definitely will continue the conversation offline. So if anyone have any questions, and so please send to our WeChat group or reach out to our representatives in China, so we can help you connect with them and to continue the conversation. So thanks a lot, Stan, for the wonderful presentation and the insight of your treatment, potential treatment for the coronavirus. And also thanks to Sean joining us and share your insight about the China and how should be successful in China. Thanks everyone to join us tonight and
Thank you
morning.
so much. Thank you, Echo. We appreciate it. Have a great day, and thanks again, everyone.